They asked for one man at dawn, and the town didn't hesitate to hand him over. The wind carried dust through the empty street like it had something to say, low and steady, brushing against boots and wooden posts, whispering through half-closed shutters that hadn't seen this kind of silence in years. 200 riders waited just beyond the ridge, their silhouettes cut against the pale morning sky, unmoving, patient, as if time bent around them instead of the other way around. Horses stood calm, heads low, breath rising in slow white clouds in the cool air. No shouting, no threats, just waiting. And in the center of that quiet pressure, a single name passed from one porch to the next like a weight nobody wanted to hold for long. Ethan Cole. He stood where they dragged him, boots scraping against the packed dirt, hands bound with rough rope that bit just enough to remind him this wasn't a mistake. Or maybe it was. He wasn't sure anymore. The town had already decided for him. Men he'd shared whiskey with, men who'd borrowed his tools and never returned them, now stood back with folded arms, eyes avoiding his. Women pulled their children inside, doors closing soft but firm, like the end of a sentence. Someone muttered that it was the only way. Someone else said it was better one man than all of them. Ethan didn't argue. He just stood there, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, like a man watching a storm he knew he couldn't outrun. The sheriff stayed close, but not too close, fingers resting near his belt out of habit, not intention. Even he didn't look convinced. "You bring him," one of the townsmen said, voice low, almost apologetic. "They'll leave." No one answered, because no one knew if that was true. They just needed it to be. Ethan lifted his eyes toward the ridge, where the first rider had begun to move. Slow, measured, like someone who understood exactly how much attention silence could command. The figure rode down alone at first, the rest holding position behind like a shadow that could fall forward at any moment. Sunlight caught along the edges of feathers and worn leather, turning them into something almost unreal, like memory more than flesh. The horse's hooves made soft, deliberate sounds against the earth, each step closing a distance that felt heavier than it should. Ethan felt it in his chest before anything else, the pull of something old, something unfinished. He didn't know why. He only knew it wasn't fear. Not quite. Around him, the town held its breath. No one reached for a weapon. Not yet. Because something about the way that rider moved made it clear, this wasn't a charge. This was a decision already made. The rider stopped 10 feet from him. Didn't speak. Didn't even look at the others. Just him. And for a long second that stretched thin as wire, nothing happened. Then the rider dismounted, boots touching ground without sound, posture straight, controlled, carrying a kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. A woman. That realization moved through the crowd like a ripple no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. She stepped forward, slow enough that every movement felt deliberate, like each inch of space mattered. Ethan watched her the way a man watches something he almost remembers but can't quite place. Her face was calm, unreadable, eyes fixed on him with a focus that cut through everything else. The rope, the people, the weight of expectation pressing down on his shoulders. Somewhere behind him, someone whispered, "That's her." Another voice answered, quieter, "Chief." The words settled heavy in the air. Tribal chief. Years had passed since Ethan last saw anything like the world she came from. Years since a storm, a narrow trail, a small figure barely holding on to breath. He didn't move, didn't speak, because something told him this moment didn't belong to him anymore. The woman stopped just within reach, close enough now that he could see the faint line of a scar along her wrist. Small, easy to miss, unless you knew where to look. Ethan's breath slowed, not because he understood, but because something inside him had already begun to. The rope around Ethan Cole's wrists had been tied by a man who would not meet his eyes, and that told him more than words ever could. It was not hatred that held him there in the center of the street. It was fear, the kind that spreads slow and quiet, like dust settling into cracks no one notices until it is too late. He could feel it in the way the townspeople stood just far enough away, in the way no one spoke his name out loud anymore, as if saying, it might bind them to whatever was about to happen next. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, boots pressing into the dry earth, and for a moment his gaze drifted past the woman in front of him, past the still line of riders waiting behind her, back toward the old water trough near the far end of the street. The wood was cracked now, sun-bleached and forgotten. But once it had been the place where he would sit at dusk, hat low, watching the sky turn red over the hills. Back when the town still spoke to him. Back when his name did not carry the quiet weight of a mistake. A faint sound pulled him back. Leather shifting. The soft creak of saddle straps settling as the horses behind the woman adjusted their stance without breaking formation. They were not restless. They were ready. There was a difference, and Ethan could feel it like a change in the air before rain. The sheriff cleared his throat somewhere off to the side, the sound thin, uncertain. "You asked for a man," he said, voice tight, directed toward the woman but never quite reaching her eyes. "This is him." The words hung there, brittle, like they might break if anyone looked at them too closely. The woman did not respond right away. She took another step forward instead, closing the space between her and Ethan until the distance felt personal, deliberate. Up close, the details became sharper. The faint lines at the corners of her eyes, not from age but from time spent looking far into distance. The way her posture held steady, balanced, like someone who had learned to carry more than just her own weight. And there, again, that small scar along her wrist. Ethan's eyes lingered on it this time, longer than before. Something in his chest shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a door he had forgotten was there beginning to open just a crack. He did not remember everything. Not all at once. But pieces had a way of finding their way back when they were needed. The woman followed his gaze, just for a moment, and something almost like recognition flickered across her expression before it settled again into calm. She lifted her hand slowly, not in threat, not in command, just enough for the movement to draw attention. The riders behind her did not move, but the town did. A ripple passed through the crowd. Someone took a step back. Someone else whispered a prayer they barely believed in. Ethan did not move. He watched her hand, the line of her wrist, the way the morning light caught against the worn leather wrap there. And then he saw it. A bracelet. Simple. Faded. Threaded with a small blue bead that had dulled with time, but still held a hint of color beneath the dust. His breath slowed. Not because he understood fully, but because something inside him had already begun to connect the pieces. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint scent of dry grass and distant rain, and for a brief second the present loosened its grip. A different night pressed at the edges of his memory. Rain coming down hard enough to blur the world into shadows. The sound of something small and struggling somewhere beyond the trail. He had not meant to get involved. He never did. But he had heard it. That was always the problem. He heard things other men chose to ignore. The woman's voice broke the silence, low and steady, her English shaped carefully, but without hesitation. "You stayed," she said. Not a question, not an accusation, just a statement, placed between them like something that had weighed on its own. Ethan's eyes lifted from the bracelet to her face. For a long second, he said nothing. The town waited. The sheriff shifted again. Somewhere, a door creaked open just enough for someone to watch without being seen. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound quiet, almost lost in the wind. Someone had to, he said. The words were simple. They always were with him. No explanation. No defense. Just truth, stripped down to what remained after everything else had been taken away. The woman studied him for a moment longer, and in that silence, something deeper moved beneath the surface, something the town could not see but could feel pressing against them all the same. Behind her, the line of riders remained still, waiting, not for an order, but for something else entirely. Something that had been set in motion years ago, on a night no one in this town had ever cared to remember. The memory did not return all at once. It never did. It came the way rain comes to dry land in this part of the country, slow at first, a scent in the air before a single drop touched the ground. Ethan stood there with his hands bound, the rope rough against his skin, and watched the woman in front of him as if she were both stranger and answer at the same time. The town behind him shifted again, restless now, uncertain, as if something invisible had begun to move beneath their feet. A man coughed. Another cleared his throat too loudly. No one liked silence when it lasted this long. It forced them to think, and thinking had never done this place much good. The sheriff tried again, voice tighter this time, reaching for authority he did not quite have. "If there is something to be said," he began, glancing between the woman and Ethan, "you say it now." The woman did not look at him, not even a flicker. Her attention stayed on Ethan, steady and unbroken, like she had crossed too much distance to be distracted by anything less than the reason she came. She lowered her hand slowly, fingers brushing against the bracelet at her wrist, and for a moment the light caught the blue bead again, just enough to pull Ethan deeper into that place in his mind where the past had been waiting. It had been a night that did not belong to this town. That was the first thing he remembered clearly. The sky had opened up without warning, rain falling hard enough to turn the trail into a narrow ribbon of mud, the kind that clung to boots and slowed horses until even the strongest animals began to hesitate. Ethan had been riding back alone, hat pulled low, coat soaked through, when he heard it. Not loud, not clear, just a sound that did not fit the rhythm of the storm. Something small, something struggling to stay that way. Most men would have kept riding. Storms had a way of hiding things better left unseen, and out here, that was often enough reason to mind your own business. Ethan had not been most men. He turned his horse without thinking, guiding it off the trail and into the brush where the sound had come from. It took him a minute to find her. Maybe less. Time moved differently in the rain. She was half hidden beneath a fallen branch, soaked, shivering, trying to stay quiet. In a world that was too loud for someone her size. A child, dark hair clinging to her face, eyes wide, not with fear alone, but with something else. Expectation. Like she had been waiting for something to find her, even if she did not know what that something would be. Ethan had dismounted slowly, hands open, voice low, speaking the way you do when you are not sure which language matters more, words or tone. Easy now, he had said, though he did not know if she understood the words. It did not matter. She understood the quiet. He remembered that. The way her breathing slowed just a little when he knelt beside her, the way she washed his face like she was measuring something deeper than what she could see. He had cut the branch away with his knife, careful, steady, never rushing, because rushing only made things worse in moments like that. She did not cry. Not once. Not even when he lifted her, light as she was, and carried her back toward the horse. That was what stayed with him later. Not the storm, not the mud, but the silence she held on to like it was the only thing she had left. Back in the present, Ethan's eyes flickered, the image fading just enough for the street to return around him. The woman took another step closer. Close enough now that the space between them felt like something that had been measured years ago and finally closed. Her voice came again, softer this time, but no less certain. You did not ask who I was, she said. Ethan's jaw shifted slightly, a habit more than a reaction. He shook his head once. Did not seem to matter. The corners of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something that carried warmth beneath restraint. Around them, the town leaned in without realizing it, drawn by a story they did not yet understand but could no longer ignore. The riders behind her remained still, like witnesses who already knew how this would end. And somewhere between the dust, the silence, and the memory of rain that no longer fell, the truth began to take shape in a way no one there could stop. The rain had not stopped that night, not for hours, not for anything, and Ethan remembered how the world had narrowed down to the space just ahead of his horse, just enough to keep moving forward without losing direction completely. The girl had not spoken then either. Not when he set her down near the small fire he managed to build beneath an overhang of rock, not when he wrapped his own coat around her shoulders, and not when he handed her a tin cup of warm water that trembled slightly in her small hands. She had watched him the entire time, quiet, alert, like she was learning something that could not be taught in words. Ethan had not asked questions. He had learned long ago that questions were often a way of making things about yourself, and that was not what the moment called for. Instead, he worked. He adjusted the fire, fed it small pieces of dry wood he kept in his saddle pack, checked the cut along her arm where the branch had scraped her, and tied it with a strip torn from his own shirt. Simple things. Necessary things. The kind that did not need explanation. Back in the present, the woman's eyes softened just enough to carry the weight of that memory without breaking under it. You gave me your coat, she said, her voice steady but carrying something deeper beneath it now, something the town could feel but not name. Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose, the faintest hint of something almost like a smile touching the edge of his mouth before it disappeared again. You looked cold, he said. A murmur moved through the crowd behind him, low and uncertain. The story was beginning to take shape in front of them, and they did not like the direction it was going. It did not match what they had told themselves for years. It did not fit the version of Ethan Cole they had grown comfortable with, the one who made mistakes, who did not belong, who could be set aside when things became inconvenient. The sheriff shifted again, his hat casting a shadow over eyes that now flickered with doubt. "That does not change why they are here," he said, trying to pull the moment back towards something he could control. But his voice lacked weight now. It did not land the way it used to. The woman turned her head slightly, not fully toward him, just enough for him to feel the shift. In her attention, it was brief, measured, and then she looked back at Ethan as if nothing else in the world had the right to hold her focus for long. "You stayed through the night," she continued, her words building not in volume, but in meaning. "Even when others came." That part settled heavier. Ethan's eyes moved just a fraction, enough to acknowledge it. He remembered that too. The sound of voices through the rain, distant at first, then closer. Men from the town riding out with lanterns and hard expressions, not looking for someone to save, but for something to take. They had seen the girl. They had seen him beside her. And they had not asked questions either. Not the kind that mattered. "You should not be helping her," one of them had said, the words sharp even through the storm. "She is not one of us." Ethan had stood then, slow, deliberate, placing himself between them and the girl without raising his voice, without reaching for anything but the space that needed to be held. "She is hurt," he had answered. Nothing more, nothing less. They had not liked that answer. People rarely did when it did not give them something to argue against. Back in the present, the woman lifted her wrist slightly, the bracelet catching the light once more, the blue bead now unmistakable to Ethan in a way it had not been before. "You chose not to listen," she said. "Not to them." The wind moved through the street again, carrying the weight of those words across every face gathered there. A few of the townspeople looked down. Others stared harder, as if refusing to see would somehow make it less real. Ethan shifted his shoulders slightly, the rope tightening just enough to remind him where he stood, but not enough to pull him out of the moment. "They talked a lot," he said quietly. "Still do." A faint sound passed through the riders behind her then. Not laughter, not quite, but something close to understanding, like a shared recognition of a truth that did not need to be explained. The woman's gaze held his, steady, certain, and for the first time since she had arrived, there was no distance left in it at all. "And still," she said, softer now, "you stayed." The words did not ask for anything. They did not accuse. They simply placed the past and the present side by side in a way that made it impossible for anyone there to pretend they were separate things. The town felt it. The shift. The quiet unraveling of something they had held on to for too long. And standing in the center of it all, Ethan Cole did not move, did not defend himself, did not look away. Because some things, once spoken, did not need anything more to be understood. The storm had begun to ease by morning, but the ground still held its weight, soft and uncertain beneath every step, and Ethan remembered how the light had come slowly, gray at first, then stretching across the hills in thin lines that made everything look older than it was. The girl had been awake before him, sitting near the edge of the fire, the coat still wrapped around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the horizon as if she had been watching it for a long time. She did not startle when he moved, did not turn right away. Only after a moment did she glance back, her expression calmer now, steadier, as if something inside her had settled during the night. Ethan had said nothing. He had simply stood there, stretching the stiffness from his arms, letting the silence remain what it was. Not empty, just honest. Back in the present, that same silence stretched again between them, but now it carried years inside it, and the town could feel that weight pressing in from all sides. The woman took a breath, slow and measured, and for the first time, her voice carried something more than memory. It carried purpose. "When they came for me," she said, her words quiet but clear enough that no one could pretend not to hear, "you did not step aside." The sheriff's hand tightened at his side. Someone in the crowd shifted uneasily, boots scraping against dirt that suddenly felt less steady than before. Ethan's eyes flickered, not away from her, but inward, following the path her words laid out. He remembered that morning more clearly now. The way the men had returned, not alone this time, but with others, with authority behind their voices and certainty in their steps. They had not come to ask. They had come to decide. "This is not your concern," one of them had said, stepping closer, his shadow. cutting across the small space Ethan had kept between himself and the girl. "Hand her over, and we will forget you were part of this." Ethan had looked at him then, really looked, the way he did when something mattered enough to see clearly. Not at the man's face, not at the badge or the rifle or the others standing behind him. He had looked at the space between them, the place where a choice lived. "She is still hurt," Ethan had answered, the same way he always spoke when the truth was simple enough to stand on its own. The man had not liked that. People rarely did when the answer refused to move. Back in the present, the woman's gaze held steady, and the faintest shift of her posture carried something deeper now, something that reached beyond memory into meaning. "You stood between them and me," she said. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear. The words settled into the street like dust after a long ride, covering everything in a thin layer that could not be brushed away. A low murmur moved through the townspeople again, but this time it was different. Not just uncertainty, something closer to discomfort. A few faces turned. A few eyes dropped. The story they had lived with for years was no longer holding its shape. The sheriff stepped forward half a pace, then stopped, as if something unseen had caught hold of him. "That was a long time ago," he said, his voice lacking the strength it once carried. "Things change." The woman turned her head fully toward him now, and the shift in her attention was enough to quiet whatever else might have been said. Her eyes did not harden. They did not need to. "Some things do," she replied, calm and certain. "Others do not." The wind moved again, lifting the edge of Ethan's shirt, brushing against the rope at his wrists, carrying the scent of dry earth and something distant that had not yet arrived. Ethan stood still, the weight of the past settling into place around him in a way that felt less like memory now and more like truth. He did not look at the town. He did not look at the sheriff. He kept his eyes on her, because that was where the moment lived. The woman lifted her hand once more, fingers resting lightly against the bracelet at her wrist, and this time there was no mistaking it. The bead, the worn leather, the years it had traveled. "You gave me something that morning," she said. Ethan's brow shifted slightly, a question forming without words. He remembered the coat, the water, the fire, small things, necessary things, the kind that did not carry weight beyond the moment. But the way she said it told him there was more. She took one more step closer, closing the last inch of space between them, and for a brief second, the entire town seemed to disappear from the edges of the world. "You gave me time," she said. The words landed differently than anything before them. Not loud, not heavy, but final in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. Behind her, the riders remained still, but the air around them had shifted, no longer waiting, no longer uncertain. The moment they had come for was no longer ahead. It was here, and in the quiet that followed, the truth stood clear enough that even those who had refused to see it could no longer look away. The words did not fade when she spoke them. They stayed there, hanging in the air like something carved into wood, something meant to last longer than the moment itself. "You gave me time." Ethan did not move, but something inside him shifted, quiet and deep, like earth settling after a long season of drought. Around them, the town seemed to shrink, its edges pulling inward, its certainty thinning with every breath that passed. No one spoke now. Not the sheriff. Not the men who had tied his hands. Not the ones who had once laughed at him across this very street. They stood there, caught between what they believed and what they were beginning to understand. The woman stepped back half a pace, not in retreat, but to be seen clearly, to let the space between them carry the truth outward. The riders behind her remained still, but now there was no tension in their stillness. It was not waiting anymore. It was witnessing. She turned slightly, just enough for her voice to reach beyond Ethan, to reach the town that had chosen him so quickly only minutes before. "He did not know my name," she said, her tone calm, steady, shaped by years that had taught her when to speak and when to let silence do the work. "He did not know my people. He did not ask what it would cost him." A few heads lowered. A few shoulders shifted. The wind moved through again, lifting dust that now seemed heavier than before, settling across boots that had stood too firm in the wrong direction. Ethan's gaze remained on her, but he could feel the shift behind him, the slow turning of something that had been fixed for too long. The woman continued, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. He saw someone who needed time, and he gave it. The words did not accuse. They did not demand. That was what made them harder to carry. The sheriff swallowed, his hand finally falling away from his belt, the gesture small, but noticed by more than just him. "We did what we had to," he said, but even he did not believe it fully now. The woman looked at him again, and this time there was no distance at all in her gaze. "So did he," she replied. No anger, no challenge, just truth, placed beside his words like a mirror he could not turn away from. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was not empty. It was full of things no one had said for years. Regret moved through it. Realization. The quiet understanding that sometimes a man's worth is not measured when it is easy to stand, but when it costs him everything to remain where he is. Ethan shifted his shoulders slightly, the rope pulling against his wrists again, but this time it felt less like restraint and more like something already loosened, something that had lost its purpose without anyone touching it. The woman turned back to him, and for the first time, there was something unmistakable in her expression. Not just recognition, not just memory, respect, deep and steady, earned without words and carried across years without being forgotten. She took one step forward, then another, closing the space again until she stood within arm's reach. The bracelet at her wrist caught the light once more, the blue bead now bright enough to be seen by anyone who chose to look. Ethan followed her movement without hesitation, his eyes steady, his posture unchanged. He had never asked for this moment, never expected it, but he did not step away from it either. The woman lifted her hand slowly, and the town held its breath without realizing it. Every eye fixed on that single motion, waiting for something they could name, something they could understand. But what came was quieter than anything they expected. Her fingers reached for the rope at his wrists, not pulling, not tearing, just resting there for a brief second, as if acknowledging what it had meant, what it had represented. Then she spoke, her voice low enough that it felt like it belonged to him alone, and yet every person in that street heard it. "You are not the man they thought you were." The words settled into him, not as a surprise, but as a recognition of something he had never needed confirmed. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound steady, grounded, like a man who had spent years standing in one place and had no intention of moving now. Behind her, one of the riders shifted, just slightly, and then another. Not forward, not aggressive, just enough to show that something had changed, that the moment had reached its turning point. The woman's hand remained at the rope, her fingers still, patient, waiting not for permission, but for the truth to finish settling where it needed to go. And in that quiet, with the dust hanging low and the morning stretching thin across the street, the town began to understand that what had come riding over the ridge at dawn was never meant to take a man away. It had come to return something they had forgotten how to see. The rope did not fall right away. It did not need to. The moment had already shifted beyond it. Ethan felt it in the way the air settled, in the way the town stopped holding its breath and instead began to carry something heavier, something closer to truth than fear. The woman's fingers rested against the coarse fibers for a second longer, not pulling, not rushing, as if she understood that what mattered was not the rope itself, but what it had meant. Then, with a movement so small it almost went unnoticed, she loosened it. Not a dramatic gesture, no sudden release, just a quiet unraveling, the tension giving way inch by inch until the rope slipped free of its purpose and hung useless at Ethan's wrists. No one stepped forward to stop her. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to argue. Ethan lowered his hands slowly, the marks on his skin faint but present, reminders of something that had already passed. He did not rub them, did not react. He simply let them fall to his sides, as steady as they had always been. The woman stepped back once more, giving him space now, not as distance, but as respect. Behind her, the riders shifted in unison, not forward, not back, just enough to show that the moment had reached its end. The sheriff took a breath that seemed to come from deeper than before, his shoulders dropping slightly, the weight of authority slipping into something more human. He looked at Ethan then, really looked, for the first time in years. He started, but the word did not carry. It faded before it could become anything else, because there were no words that could stand where they now stood. The town remained still, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer the silence of waiting. It was the silence of seeing. A woman near the edge of the street lowered her gaze. A man who had once laughed too loud shifted his hat in his hands, unsure where to place his eyes. The story they had lived with had broken apart, and in its place stood something simpler, something harder to ignore. The woman turned again, her attention moving across the faces gathered there, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a clarity that carried its own kind of weight. "You chose fear," she said, her voice steady, reaching all of them without rising. "He chose otherwise." No accusation followed, no demand, just the truth, set down where it could not be moved. The wind passed through the street again, softer now, carrying less dust, as if even the land had begun to settle. Ethan stood where he was, free now, but unchanged in the way he held himself. He did not step forward, did not step back, because this was never about moving. It was about standing. The woman's gaze returned to him, and for a moment, the rest of the world fell away again. "I left that morning," she said quietly, the words meant for him, though the town still heard them. "Because you gave me the chance to." Ethan nodded once, a small movement, but certain. "Seemed like the right thing," he said. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but something warmer, something earned. She reached to her wrist and, for the first time, untied the bracelet. The leather came loose easily, worn from years of being carried, from time and distance and memory. She held it in her hand for a moment, looking at it the way one looks at something that has traveled far without losing its meaning. Then she stepped forward and placed it gently into Ethan's open palm. The bead caught the light again, brighter now than before, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to return. Ethan looked down at it, then back at her, his expression unchanged, but something in his eyes settling into place. "You kept it alive," she said. He closed his hand around the bracelet, slow, deliberate, like a man who understood the weight of small things. Behind her, one of the riders turned his horse slightly, the others following without command, the movement quiet, respectful. Not a retreat, not a departure yet, just a shift, the kind that comes when a purpose has been fulfilled. The woman held Ethan's gaze one last time, and in that look was everything that did not need to be spoken. Years, distance, choice, and the quiet understanding that what had been given once had not been forgotten. Then she stepped back, turning toward her people, the space between them widening again, but not empty this time. Never empty again. And as the first horse began to move, slow and steady toward the edge of town, the people who had once decided Ethan's place stood in silence, watching something they could not take back, and something they would not forget. The horses did not rush as they turned. They moved the way the wind moves across open land, steady, certain, carrying purpose without needing to prove it. One by one, the riders aligned behind their leader, the rhythm of hooves soft against the earth, each step measured as if the ground itself deserved respect. Dust lifted gently beneath them, not in a storm, not in chaos, just enough to mark that something had passed through and changed the shape of the morning. Ethan stood where he was, the bracelet still resting in his palm, the worn leather warm now against his skin. He did not close his hand right away. He looked at it for a moment longer, tracing the faint cracks in the material, the small blue bead that had carried years inside something so simple. Then, slowly, he closed his fingers around it, not gripping, not holding tight, just enough to keep it with him. The town did not move. Not yet. They watched as the riders began to leave, their formation holding even as they turned away from the street, away from the place where fear had gathered only minutes before. No one reached for a weapon. No one called out, because there was nothing left to stop. The sheriff stepped forward at last, his boots sounding louder than they should have in the quiet that remained. He stopped a few feet from Ethan, close enough now that there was no distance left to hide behind. For a moment, he said nothing. His gaze dropped briefly to the ground, then lifted again, slower this time, as if the act itself required more than it once had. "I was wrong," he said finally. The words were simple, barely above a breath, but they carried more weight than anything he had said before. Ethan did not answer. He did not need to. He had never been a man who asked for words when actions had already spoken. The sheriff nodded once, almost to himself, then stepped back, not retreating, just making space where it had not existed before. Around them, others began to shift. A man removed his hat, holding it against his chest without knowing exactly why. A woman stepped forward half a pace, then stopped, her hands clasped together as if searching for something to do with them. No one apologized out loud. No one explained. Because the moment did not belong to them. It never had. At the edge of the street, the woman slowed her horse, just for a second, turning slightly in the saddle. She did not ride back. She did not call out. She only looked once more toward Ethan, her gaze steady, carrying something that did not need to be named. Gratitude, perhaps. Or something quieter. Something that did not fade with time. Ethan met her eyes, the distance between them now wide, but no longer empty. He gave a small nod, nothing more, the kind of acknowledgement that men like him offered, when words would only take away from what already existed. She held his gaze for a heartbeat longer, then turned forward again, guiding her horse toward the open land beyond the town. The riders followed, their figures growing smaller against the horizon, their presence fading into the same silence they had arrived with. The dust settled slowly behind them, the last traces of movement dissolving into stillness. And when they were gone, truly gone, the town remained as it was, but not as it had been. Something had shifted too deeply to return. Ethan stood alone again in the center of the street, just as he had so many times before, but the space around him felt different now. Not lighter, not heavier, just clearer. He slipped the bracelet into his pocket, the motion quiet, deliberate, like placing something exactly where it belonged. Then he turned, not toward the town, not toward the people who now watched him with different eyes, but toward the far end of the street where the road stretched out beyond what could be seen. His boots pressed into the dirt with the same steady rhythm they always had, each step unhurried, unforced, carrying him forward without the need for anything more. Behind him, no one followed. No one called his name. They simply watched, the silence no longer empty, but filled with something they would carry long after he was gone from their sight. And in that quiet, beneath the wide open sky, the truth settled the way it always does out here, not loud, not announced, just present enough that anyone willing to stand still could finally see it. The road stretched long past the edge of the town, fading into a pale line where earth met sky, and Ethan Cole walked it the way he always had, steady, unhurried, like a man who understood that distance was not something to conquer, but something to live through. The sound of his boots softened as he moved farther from the buildings, from the eyes that still followed him even after he was no longer close enough to hear them breathe. Behind him, the town remained standing, unchanged in wood and stone, but altered in a way that could not be repaired or undone. People did not return to what they had been after moments like that. They carried them, whether they wanted to or not. Ethan did not look back. He never had a habit of doing that. The past had a way of finding its own place without needing to be revisited. The bracelet rested in his pocket, its presence small but constant, a quiet reminder of something that had traveled further than he ever would. The sun climbed higher, warming the land inch by inch, pulling the chill out of the morning air, and with it came the familiar sounds of the plains, wind through dry grass, the distant call of something unseen, the kind of quiet that was never truly empty. He reached the bend in the road where the town finally slipped out of view, hidden behind a rise of land that had been there long before any of them arrived. That was where he stopped. Not for long, just enough to stand still and let the world settle into its place around him. He reached into his pocket and took the bracelet out again, turning it over once in his hand. The leather was worn, softened by time, but it had held, just like the choice that had given it meaning in the first place. Ethan looked out across the open land, the horizon stretching wide, untouched, carrying no memory of what had happened behind him. That was the thing about places like this. They did not remember. People did. He slid the bracelet back into his pocket, this time deeper, secure, not as something to be returned, but as something to be kept. A part of the story that no longer needed to be told out loud. Back in the town, the street remained quiet long after he had gone. The sheriff stood where he had been, hat in his hands now, turning it slowly as if the motion might help him understand something that had come too late. A few men drifted away, their steps slower than before, their voices low, uncertain, carrying none of the confidence they once had when speaking about Ethan Cole. A woman knelt near the edge of the street, brushing dust from a spot where the rope had fallen, not because it needed to be cleaned, but because the act itself gave her something to do with the weight she felt. No one spoke of punishment. No one spoke of making things right, because some things did not ask for repair. They asked for recognition. Days would pass, then weeks. The town would return to its rhythm, the same routines, the same habits, but something would remain beneath it all, quiet, steady, impossible to ignore. When a stranger passed through, they would speak of that morning in softer tones, not with pride, not with certainty, but with something closer to respect. Not for what they had done, but for what one man had chosen not to do. And somewhere far beyond the reach of that town, where the land opened wider and the air carried fewer voices, a man walked on without needing to be seen. He did not carry anger. He did not carry regret. Just the same quiet understanding he had always lived by, that doing what is right does not always change the world in the moment. Sometimes it waits. It travels. It grows in silence until one day, without warning, it returns. Not with noise, not with force, but with a kind of truth that does not need to ask for anything in return. And out here, where the wind moves slow and the sky never rushes, that is enough. It has always been enough.